FM News Talk 97.1.
On-demand audio.
In just a few minutes, we're going to speak with Tim Fitch. He was in the news. He's with the St. Louis County Police, and he was in the news recently because we've had all of this discussion about security in schools after the tragedy in Sandy Hook. And St. Louis County Police Chief Tim Fitch, he's on the phone with us right now. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but he's been quoted in a number of articles talking about firearm security in schools. And he was one of the few that came out and suggested that perhaps some people should be armed to protect the well-being of students in the classroom. Sir, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Dana. How are you? Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, absolutely. And obviously everyone is still, it makes you heartsick when you see things like this happen on television. And, you hear about schools that they have safety devices on the doors, which means you have to be buzzed in. But, we heard reports that the shooter apparently just busted into the school. What are your thoughts on this? And you've been quoted as saying, well, I think maybe some people should be armed to protect students, which, may not be a bad thing to discuss. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, as a last resort, let me throw that out there first. The first option, I think, is to have a fully trained armed police officer at the schools. Or if you can't have a police officer, a fully trained security officer, someone that can have lethal force readily available. In absence of that, because many schools say, we cannot afford that. That's just not going to happen. We can have discussions all day long about capacity of magazines and what kind of weapons should be out there and all the mental health services, which, by the way, should be improved. But the critical moment I'm talking about that needs to be addressed and we need to have an adult conversation about is when an intruder makes it into the school and they start shooting and then law enforcement's notified and they're on the way. That's 5 minutes, or I think in the Connecticut case we heard it was 10 minutes until law enforcement got there and he killed himself. We need to have a discussion about that critical time period. What do we do in the meantime? If you can't run, if you can't hide, then you have to fight. And we have a video on our website that's called that exactly, Run, Hide, Fight. But when you fight, you have to have a fighting chance.
Right.
You could talk all day long about throwing books at a guy with an AR-15 that walks in. You could talk about throwing chairs, all those kind of things. But the only way that I'm aware of to successfully face lethal force is with lethal force. And I am absolutely sure that most schools out there have one or two people that would easily stand up and say, I'd be willing to be the one, I'll be willing to go through the training that the police department would offer, and I'll be the guy to step up to the plate until you get there. We have to reduce the body count, and that's the only way I could think of doing it. The picture of these little kids just being executed as sitting ducks just doesn't sit well with me, and I think we have to do something other than just talk it to death.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And you have some really great suggestions in there as well. And the reports that we have, especially of the heroic principal, who, as soon as Adam Lanza opened fire, she lunged at him. And if there had been someone there, if it's not a teacher or a principal who's armed, if there's someone there who had been able to lunge at him with something more than just their fists, because fists, you know this, fists against a firearm just aren't going to cut it. I wonder, and speculation, sometimes you're afraid to do that because it just causes more pain, but sometimes you wonder, would the outcome have been different?
Well, we won't know until we try it.
Exactly.
We won't know that.
Well, how does the community, how does the St. Louis County, what do you hear from individuals when you suggest this? Is this something that they seem open to?
You mean other than the ones that think I should be fired just for mentioning it?
Yeah, we'll talk about that, which kind of shocks me a little bit, by the way, because I know you've taken some heat for it. Well,
and you know what? These lives, we feel, our police department feels personally responsible for our kids' lives, and I think that's what you'd want from us. And it's shame on us if we can't come up with some other idea other than just letting our kids being sitting ducks.
Right.
So I've thrown this idea out there. By the way, it's not a new idea. We talked about this after Columbine.
Right.
And then you know what happened. You had all the studies and the commissions. They gave us some money for cops in schools that dried up 4 years later. And it's all gone now, and here, guess what? It happened again. And it's happened many times in between that, not to the extent that we just saw in Connecticut. But I guarantee you this. There's some other crazed individual out there right now that's trying to figure out how to do something bigger and badder than this last guy.
Well, and isn't that kind of the case, too? We hit on that a little bit yesterday, that I don't know if it's just because the oversaturation of media coverage, but you always have, it's like you have an earthquake. You have a massive earthquake, and then afterwards you have aftershocks for like a few days. And it seems like we have these aftershock occurrences where, someone will make threats, or someone, they're minor compared to the initial tragedy. But you always seem to have instances like this. Is that something that you've discovered as well?
Absolutely. And as soon as it kind of dies down and it's quiet, nothing's happened for a while, something else will crop up, whether it be the economy or whatever's going to happen next. And we kind of forget about that discussion and we move on and nothing changes.
Right. There's we've had a couple of calls, and some are asking, well, are there police scheduled to go to schools and protect children, or how do the police, you got into it a little bit, whether someone volunteers or whether someone, at the school says, I'll go and get the training for it. What would schools do? What would be the first thing that you would suggest for schools in terms of better protection for students?
Well, there's many physical, to the physical plant of the building that they can do. That we're going to have a long discussion with them tomorrow about that. But at the end of the day, how do you address someone that makes it into the school? Somebody said, well, the building's locked, they can't get in. Well, guess what? They could break in.
Right.
Or they could walk in the beginning of the morning when the kids are walking in. Kids got to get in there somehow. The kids got to go out on the playground. We have to have a plan in place that's doable and that we don't take years to study, that will immediately be able to confront a armed individual that is really hell-bent on making a name for himself.
Right, exactly. And that's, and I want to say that I appreciate you being one of the first to speak out about this, because I kind of get the general sense that there are some in the population out there whose general aversion to firearms somehow overshadows the real issue here, which is how do we protect our students when they're in the classroom? Because these incidences keep happening in places where, and I don't want to point this out for political purposes, but strictly for statistical reasons, these instances keep happening in gun-free zones. You have to have you need someone there who's going to be able to fight fire with fire, basically, and that's
no doubt.
That's just kind of how it is.
No doubt, it's not a pleasant conversation to have. The people that are in denial about it, all they can say when I say to them, okay, then what's your idea during the shooting period, this critical moment? I'm comfortable when law enforcement gets there, we're going to eliminate the threat. But what I'm not comfortable about is what happens in between. And nobody can come up with an answer that's doable that will address that issue. They want to talk about, well, we need to have better mental health funding. We need to eliminate assault weapons. Those are not part of my conversation. My conversation is that critical moment when the shooting is occurring, how do you stop it?
And that's what we need to have the discussion about nationally. Well, I so appreciate, again, you speaking out on this, because this is not something that, we have to have this conversation, and people need to get over their aversion to anything. If the goal is keeping students safe, then we need to figure out what to do until law enforcement can arrive, and that's hopefully we can get to that. Police Chief Tim Fitch with St. Louis County Police. Sir, we thank you so much for speaking out. You have agreement here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Thanks for taking care of the wounded warriors. My son's in Afghanistan serving. Thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you, and please give him our thanks for his service. We'll be praying for him. Thank you.
I sure will. Thank you.
Take care.